It can be physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, spiritual, or even financial. Domestic violence takes many forms, and no matter how it manifests itself, it's the leading cause of serious injury to women, regardless of cultural or socioeconomic background. Trying to dismantle its roots may seem like untying 1,000 knots of sexism, racism, and our culture of violence. But if ever two women were up to the task, you're about to meet them.
But don't let us give you the wrong impression. When 1 in 3 women killed each year will die at the hands of their spouse or intimate partner, it is by no means just a female problem. And at the center, the Healing Center, entire families affected by domestic violence take the first step towards self-sufficiency and healing. And we're joined by the center's co-founder and executive director, Antonia Clemente. Welcome to BK Live, Antonia.
Great to be here today.
Happy to have you. And Naima Ramos-Chapman is a filmmaker. Her work, And Nothing Happened, has been called vulnerable, insightful, and visceral. Thanks for joining us today, Naima.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Antonia, why don't we start with you? Tell us a little bit about the Healing Center and the work that you all do there.
So the Healing Center started in the year 2000 to address domestic violence in the community. We started in a church as a mission of a church because we also saw the need to address domestic violence within faith communities, a community that we don't talk about very much. So since its inception, we addressed intimate partner violence. We work with women who are victims of intimate partner violence. We work with teens. We have a teen program, Daughters of the Lotus, for young girls who witness domestic violence or who are already in teen dating violence relationships. We also have a children's program, the High Five program for children who witness domestic violence in the home or affected by domestic violence. Another component that we just had recently is elder abuse. It's another community that we don't talk about, but elder abuse is on the rise, and it has been. So we provide direct services. We do community awareness in the community. The Healing Center also is the sponsor of the New York City Teen Dating Violence Awareness Walkathon. We realize that teens are also exposed and experience some form of violence, teen dating violence. So we raise awareness every April on the issue of teen dating violence.
So Naima, we've heard about a lot of approaches that they take in the inception in the church basement, but there's a lot of problems and a lot of different approaches. You took a more artistic bent in sharing something personal that is all too universal.
Yeah, so my film, it's a short film, And Nothing Happened, and it is an autobiographical account of a sexual assault that happened to me. And so what I wanted to do with this film was twofold. Once, I think, it's very cathartic and healing for those who are survivors of sexualized violence or intimate partner violence to tell their own stories in whatever form that may take, whether it's writing a letter or talking to a therapist or making a film. But also I recognize that in films I saw, often rape was, and the trauma around it was mostly shown about the brutality of the act itself versus what happens after and the aftermath and the trauma that sticks with you for years on end. So my focus was, how does this show up in our homes and in our families and communities? Because rape is not just a woman's issue. It's something that affects all of us and also affects those safe spaces that we do dwell in after we've left the trauma. So I was really focused on showing that aspect of sexualized violence.
You both do that kind of work, right? So working with the families, how important is that to the work that you guys do to bring in the entire family involved?
It's very important because intimate partner violence affects not just the victim, but affects everyone in the family. So it's an issue that everyone's affected, the community is affected by it as well. Because if we know that someone in our community is being victimized in any way, shape, or form, and we don't do nothing and we don't respond, and we let it go on, like if nothing has happened, then we're also responsible as a community. So it's important to work with the entire family. It's important to work with the community. It's important to know who in the community, where people in the community can go to. For resources. Resources are limited in many ways, but I think once an individual finds resources for them, it's a way to healing. It's a way of them telling their story. Stories are important. Telling your story is important. For many of the people we work with, for the first time they tell their stories. Because when a person is experiencing some form of violence, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, or sexual violence as well, it's kept inside. It's a kept secret. They don't share it. You know why? Because the question, who's going to believe me? If I tell, are they going to believe me? Is it safe for me to do so? Yeah. So it is important to tell the story.
And what's going to happen to me
And what's going to happen to me afterwards? Am I going to be ostracized? And are people going to believe me? And I think it's so important for victims or anyone experiencing any form of abuse to find a safe space where they can tell their stories, where they're validated, because that's the beginning of healing for that individual.
Well, I guess it's all too common now that we hear about that almost second wave of victimization that comes if you do decide to step forward and even take another step of trying to prosecute or get some kind of action taken outside of yourself to really bring someone to account for violence they may have committed against you. So we've seen, even as far as like slut shaming, things that happen online, especially with Facebook and all these new technologies that folks have. But what about, I want to go to you again, Naima, about that social component of it to empower people who are survivors to come forward and sort of, your film is one voice against 1,000 that give so many bad messages to survivors.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, I did have to go through a lot of people I even considered, progressive and friends and those who would have a sensitive ear. They don't even realize how conditioned you are by society to silence victims. So a lot of the onus is shifted to the victim, and you're told, well, what could you have done differently to prevent this tragedy from happening to you? So that's one element of it. And for me, I think the most empowering thing, it is important to find these safe spaces for sure, but I think having agency and empowering yourself to move through spaces that aren't, like that people, you have to take another step and educate those around you who don't even realize that what they're saying is harmful. Like their intention, they want to support you.
As if you need one more thing, then you have to become the educator.
I know, it's really unfair, but I think the work is there for all of us to do. And how do you re-educate a whole society in, seeing how we're all complicit in generating perpetual conditional violence towards women. So I think, for us, it's creating a film is just one aspect of that, and also learning how to talk to other women about, how to tell your story in the safest way you feel possible, but also, we can't wait for change. You have to also sometimes be willing to enact that change.
Just for we have some startling numbers in front of us, and this is just a fact sheet from the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence for last year, and there were 26 homicides in 2015. And 3 of them sadly occurred here in Brooklyn. They're all tragic. And just the reported incidents, and these are only reported ones, some 200 and almost 80,000 reported incidents. So everything that is bad doesn't rise to the level of the news where we see a woman's throat slashed because she's telling a man to get out her face, or someone who shot on the parkway because she buffed someone's advances. So there's a lot happening that doesn't get our attention. What can we share with those women to say your story is still valid and you can still get help before you become a headline?
Right. So, when we look at the stats at the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence, and we see the stats in New York City, in particular Brooklyn, we had 86,819 incidents that were reported. But I want to talk to that person who never reports. Because that person who never reports, never calls, so these statistics are much higher, but the person who never calls, the person who's afraid to call,
who's afraid of immigration, who's in a bad financial situation,
if we talk about, domestic violence within the immigrant community, it's People are afraid of reporting. People are afraid because of misconceptions about being deported. So there,
That'll
His
actually
name
be
is on
held
the lease.
against them.
Yeah.
That'll actually be the power held
that's
against them.
The batterer uses that, right? The immigration status. Well, if you try to report me, I'm going to call INS, or I'm going to call ACS, and I'm going to report you to the authorities. So that creates a lot of fear, and people don't come forward. People don't come forward because of fear, because of the stigma. For the listeners who've experienced some form of violence and are listening, I think it's really important, and I urge you to seek out some resources that are available. I mean, I'm really glad that we're talking about this subject around domestic violence. We don't get the attention we should, and we only get it during October. But you know what? Domestic violence is every day. In this country, every 9 seconds, a person is a victim of domestic violence. It's not going away. And the only way that's going to go away is talking about it, calling, holding people accountable, holding our communities accountable, holding our, city officials accountable. Say, hey, what is really going on in my district or in my community? I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done in the last 16 years since I first started, but we still have a long way to go. I truly believe that we can eradicate domestic violence in our communities, and that can happen when we as a community and as a people come forward.
There was no DV questions last night at the debates.
No.
Not surprising.
But there was an act of violence done, though. When we talk about domestic violence or violence against individuals, it's the subtleness of violence that takes place. And we see, I personally see it in this election, how the talk against women, what's the message it sends? It perpetuates more sexism in our society. When we've just getting started to address the issue and we have conversations at presidential levels where it degrades women. So what is the message it sends to our society about sexism and to women?
We have a long way to go still. Long way to go. Naima, tell us how the film is going and how we can see it.
The film is going well. I've got a lot of positive responses from it. I think it's doing what I wanted it to do, is to create a visceral reaction that kind of lets the audience figure out what they want to do about sexualized violence versus telling them what to do. Because I think that's important, is like teaching, especially men, because I do feel like the onus is a lot on women on what we can do in order to speak up. It's also what can society do to stop silencing women.
A few seconds left, Naima. Tell us where we can see it.
It'll screen at Videology October 12th with a lot of other films from Slam Dance and also Tacoma Film Festival.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So if you're in Williamsburg or Washington,
Yeah.
Say it. Thank you so much for joining us, both of you.